We've got Iris Rajanayagam, who's the director of Zartsplitter in Berlin. She's a historian. She works on post and decolonial theories, intersectionality, politics of memory and social change. She's also the director of the non-profit organization Zartsplitter and a researcher and lecturer at the Alice Salomon University of Applied Science. We've also got Rhoda Bourtang, who is the archives supervisor at the Black Cultural Archives in London, which was founded in 1981. And the Black Cultural Archives is the only national heritage centre dedicated to collecting, preserving and celebrating the histories of African and Caribbean people in the UK. And finally, we've got Jennifer Vickers, who is a community engagement manager at the Ahmed Iqbal Ullah Education Trust in Manchester. She's a visual artist and heritage practitioner with 20 years experience of working in museums, galleries and archives. So Kath Badai, who's one of the leads on the Multicultural Archives project, is going to just give us an overview of the aims and objectives of the project. But I just want to give a little bit of background to say that this event is part of Northumbria University's Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project, and I've mentioned it before. I'll keep mentioning it, the Multicultural Organisational Archives Project. And this is being developed in partnership with community-based organisations Sangini and Vamos, who I'm very pleased are here today with us. The project aims to collect and publicise some of the dispersed organisational archives of Black and minoritized community organisations in the northeast of England, and it hopes to develop these into an online digital archive. And this is a much needed project, as the northeast has a really rich history of incredible grassroots heritage projects that represent the intercultural diversity of the northeast. But that legacy has often been neglected, and there are few digital archives that are actually accessible. As a region that's so defined by its post-industrial landscape and remains an area of socioeconomic deprivation, being one of the regions hardest hit by COVID and the pandemic, ensuring that the representation of Black and minoritized communities should be an integral, if not central part of the intercultural archiving of our social history. So I just want to hand over to Kath now, who's going to talk about the aims and objectives of the Multicultural Project.
Hi there. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Rosie. I'll probably be going over a few points that Rosie's been mentioning to you, but I just want to say a very warm welcome to everyone here and for taking time out from your busy schedules this Saturday afternoon. So yeah, I'm Kath Badai, some of you know me, and I am the research assistant here at Northumbria University, managing the Multicultural Organisational Archives project. Yes, and it is funded by Arts and Humanities Research Council. We are grateful to them. But it's also in partnership with Sangini and Vamos. We can't say that enough. They are our partners, and they've been with us for quite a while. And also our advisory board, Everyday Muslim, the Angelou Centre, and Tyne Archives. The project aims to bring together, collect, and display the archives on an online digital archive space, a website, of our partners and other Black and racialized organizations, or BAME organizations as we know them, here in the Northeast. I use archives here in the broadest sense, the paper records, publications, photographs, videos, films, and so on. Our project also involves training ourselves, these organizations, and future Black heritage workers, in itself a very enriching process of learning and knowledge exchange. And I just want to say that these archives are not just objects, but over many years of knowledge and actions, the efforts and the energies, the blood, sweat and tears moments and movements, as I'd like to say, the celebratory highs and also the lows of the activism and change of Black organizations. And this work and their presence still mainly goes unnoticed. It's fragmented, misrepresented, underfunded, marginalized, but more about that later from our panelists. However, these organizations are themselves, and I think this is very important, the pillars in our society and vanguards in the community and cultural context of the Northeast and beyond, instrumental in shaping and building our cultural ecology and continuing to do so. But today we are here to find out more from the experts and for them to impart their knowledge on us on how to do so, especially in our changing times. No pressure, of course, to the panelists, nor the audience. So Susan, I'm going to just hand it over to you now to tell us a bit more about our partners and to say thank you for your audience for being here and joining us.
Hi, everybody. So I'm the project lead on the Multicultural Organizational Archives project. This is a follow-on from another AHRC project called Multicultural Heritage. And I guess you've both said everything that I wanted to say. Thank you for all coming. Thank you for sure to our partners, Sangedi, VAMOS, Everyday Muslim, Angelou Center, and of course, Northumbria University. And I guess that's it, really. I mean, let's continue on now. Rosie, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks very much, Kath and Susan, for that introduction, and Kath especially because you've raised some of the key issues no doubt we'll be discussing today. So now I want to introduce our panelists. They're each going to give a 5-minute overview of the organisation and its motivations before we move on to questions, specific questions that we're raising in terms of this event. But also we're going to open those questions out to the floor as well. So please do put any comments or questions in the chat as we go along. We really welcome that. So I'd like to start with Sadia. If you could just introduce the work you do, your organisation and the motivations for your work, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, first of all, Susan and Kath, for inviting me. Where do I start? Everyday Muslim was founded in 2013. It's largely a born digital contemporary archive, and it consists of 3 separate collections of 3 different communities. We've collected almost 100 oral history interviews, a few hundred photographs, documents, and recordings of all of our conferences and all of the events that we've ever held in the past 6 years, although you can see most of them on our website, YouTube channel, and on our SoundCloud. We've also created exhibitions, educational resources, just so that the archives are seen as a living thing, something that we can actually learn from, something that's tangible, something that's not outside of the grasp of the community. So those sort of outputs, if you like, are really essential to the work that we do, as well as the actual collecting side. At the moment, 2 of the collections have an online catalogue, and we're also making the collections available digitally online, so hopefully you can access most of them from our website sort of early next year. The collections so far, because the Muslim community here the collections so far sort of only reflect a small section of the community, but we're trying to be as reflective as possible. At the moment, we've got collections around the South Asian community, the white convert community, and also one project which we'll probably talk more about later is the Black Muslim Archive at the George Padmore, which is at the George Padmore Institute at the moment. And that one particularly, it was very important for us to be able to reflect the diversity of the community. So it wasn't just, oh, this is the Black Afro-Caribbean Muslim community, but it was very important for us to be able to show that this is the Black Afro-Caribbean community, who also are representatives of several different nationalities, ethnicities, and cultures. So that particular project isn't focusing on one particular community. So we have representatives from Somalia, Uganda, Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, Sierra Leone, literally almost every country in Africa, and a lot of the Caribbean countries, just to show the diversity of that community. So Black isn't just synonymous with the racial version or the politicized version of what Black means. And that was very important for myself as a Muslim to be able to convey that, because there's a lot of issues around just using the term Black. And so for myself, it was really important to be able to say this is a Black African, Afro-Caribbean heritage project, and not just use the term Black on its own. Apart from the archival work that we do, we like to use our platform to build a network of support between academics, historians, archivists, and the diverse community that we work in. So just so that we can support and enrich each other's work. The cross-sector unity is especially important to us because we're working in a community archive environment. We're not historians or archivists. So everything that we do, we're kind of learning and working at the same time. So it's like, you know, work experience times, I don't know, it's off the charts. So we're trying to learn everything that we need to do as well while we're practicing it. You've asked for motivations for why we do this work, and it was really difficult trying to focus on something, on one particular motivation, because there's so many from which the project really started from. But I think what's become one of the most important motivations, I would say, is to relay to those who are underrepresented in the archives from our communities, especially the importance of an authentic representation in the archive and the heritage space, and consequently to know how that then manifests in our history and the education of that history. So it's very important for us to be able to express that through the archive collections that we're working on. So by that I mean initiatives like ours are documenting through the collection of oral histories and photographs, documents, letters, films, cassettes, and ephemera such as flyers from shops and businesses, Ramadan timetables, and even posters from bands, just to create an archive collection that provides a self-authored narrative of a time, of a place, of their community, which gives them the ability to develop their historical narrative from a lived experience and in their own words. Also to provide the community, the community's narrative from a broader social and political context and perspective, which from my own research I found is sort of is missing really from existing, and when I say existing archives, there's hardly any in the mainstream archives organization. So from the existing archives, rather than giving sort of an outsider's perspective, which I find it's very ethnically and racially coming from a very colonial and post-colonial stereotypes. And I find that whether that's conscious or unconscious or just misinformed perspectives, I find that it's given a skewed perspective of our lived experience and of our narratives overall, and that kind of leads me to kind of like a subsection of this motivation of why we want to do this, and the only way I can explain that we need to be able to, through not just representation but authentic representation, is be able to how do I explain this? I think what I'm trying to say is, if existing representation isn't an authentic representation of our narrative, and if the politics of those who are in power, whether intentionally or unintentionally, reinforce the misrepresentation, then we need greater representation from our communities in the workplace, in the form of archivists, historians, and even community consultants, who but also have actual power to make changes. So there's no point of having a Black or an Asian archivist, but they don't have the power to make changes in some of the catalogues, for example, if they've come across things that they don't feel is an accurate representation. So it's got to be representation with some level of power to be able to make changes where it's needed. And it's not in the way that it's not from a point of activism or sorry, I'm going to finish up now. Not in a rebellious way, but just in a way in which to give a fairer and a better representation of the community's stories and their narratives, and give them a better representation of what the story is. And I'm going to stop because I'm going over.
Thank you very much, Sadia, for that. I'd now like to introduce Rhoda.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to introduce Black Archives. I'm going to try and keep it a bit brief because I'm sure we'll get into more detail when we have our discussion. But for those of you that aren't familiar with Black Cultural Archives work, BCA started as an organisation in 1981, so next year is our 40th anniversary. And BCA grew from a community response to lots of different social upheaval in the late 70s and early 80s. So events such as the Brixton Uprisings in 1981 and the New Cross Massacre in 1981, and the failing of the Race Relations Act of 1976, and also kind of underpinned by the ongoing underachievement of Black children in British schools, meant that a group of people, our founders, kind of came together and sought to create a place where Black people, people of African and Caribbean descent in the UK could kind of find themselves and have a space of positive representation. So this was also influenced by an African-American activist called Queen Mother Moore, who was doing a similar sort of work in America. And she kind of gave a rallying call to create a monument to Black history. And our founders took this up. And actually our official charity title is the slightly less catchy African People's Historical Monument Foundation, which kind of speaks directly to that call. So the project was, very much an educational project in its foundings, meant to be a place for Black children, for Black people, to have access to the contributions of Black people in history and culture, and also to kind of spread awareness and be a place of pride, really. So this kind of act of self-help expanded, and our founders created what they originally called an archive museum. So as time has gone on, we're kind of primarily seen as an archive, and our archive collections are at the heart of what we do. But we do also have museum objects, and in its kind of genesis, BCA was meant to be a place that was both. And for us, the value of archiving is really rooted in a mission to redress the historical balance in the UK in terms of the presence of Black people in archives and museums and memory keeping projects. So we're trying to make the case for ourselves and make the case for the contributions of African and Caribbean people in the UK for centuries. Saying that our collecting policy and our remit is mainly around like post World War II, so 1945 onwards, in terms of like the type of materials we collect, although we do have some materials that date back to the Roman era, which is just representative of the wider picture of African and Caribbean people's presence in the UK. So in terms of the collections themselves, BCA started very much as a community archive. So, it was our founders and people involved in the actual project who were collecting materials, going out to secondhand shops and antique shops and just amassing as much material as they could. And over time, this is kind of formalized into a more traditional looking archive in some respects, in terms of things like quality for the housing of the materials, but it's still very much rooted in the people who made the archive, and that's something unique to BCA. So we've got over 3,500 records, over 40 collections, which all reflect the history and presence of African and Caribbean communities in Britain. So these include personal papers, organisational records, photographs, periodicals, and ephemera. And I was quite interested actually that Sadia already mentioned like ephemera as something that you also collect, and this is something I see as maybe common between Black archives in terms of what is seen as really useful material for us to have. So aside from the collections themselves, we also, at our building in Brixton, which is at 1 Windrush Square, hold exhibitions. And we also have a learning programme which really kind of supports and looks outwards from the archive collections. We also have a workforce development program. So we kind of see our work as not being just around, you know, the collection itself, but also thinking about the archives and heritage sector at large in terms of what the sector looks like, what it doesn't look like, and how BCA can help advocate for Black archivists and Black researchers, you know, in order to strengthen Black knowledge production in the UK. So that's very much a part of our work, alongside trying to advocate for different people in our communities, whether it's Black researchers, like I just mentioned, or whether it's kind of trying to redress historic imbalance in the case of groups of people such as the Windrush generation, as has been dubbed. But, you know, obviously the story is very complex and, you know, yeah, it's extremely complex. So I guess that's a really brief overview to what we do. Maybe, have you already shown my photographs? Because I could talk about those.
Yes.
If I have some time. Okay, well, they were, just to say, they were photographs of our founders picketing Lambeth Town Hall in 1984 to kind of make the case for a permanent site for BCA, because BCA has been around as an organisation since 1981, but BCA has only had a permanent building since 2014. So if you can think of, you know, the decades of work that took, and yeah, the decades of struggle that took. So I just wanted to show you a photo of what that kind of looks like in action. Alongside, I think I also chose a photo of our building, which you can come and see because we're back open now after the national lockdown. So I think I'll leave it there and pick up on conversations when we all get a chance to speak.
Great, thank you so much, Rhoda. That was fantastic. I'd like to introduce Iris now.
Thank you, Rosie. I would also like to thank Kath and Susan for inviting me, and also Sadia and Rhoda for your inputs and for your important work. Yes, as Rosie told you, I am director of Gsatsbitter, which is a small Berlin organization. We mainly work in the fields of decolonial theory and praxis, cultures of memory and empowerment, and intersectional approach forms the basis of all our work. We see Gsatsbitter as a space that deals with the recentering of resistant narratives and histories from a BIPOC perspective, and we strongly work community-oriented with and through our different BIPOC communities. I will be talking about one of our most recent projects, which is called Living Archives. It is a website. Maybe just to go one step back, Gsatsbitter mainly does events or public events like workshops, but also bigger things like conferences and series and film screenings, panel talks, and things like that. And we've been doing this for the past 6 or 7 years now in different contexts. And in the course of our work, and especially in the context of our larger project last year called Passing It On, we became more and more aware of the importance of self-determined, self-defined documentation, archiving, and making accessible of knowledge. So also something that Sadia and Rhoda have been talking about as well. Yes, and making this knowledge accessible, especially to our BIPOC communities. And the Living Archives is one of the projects that we see in this context of our work. And what was important to us when launching this project, which is, by the way, funded by the Civic, what's the German, the English name? It's the Germany-wide Civic Center for Education. Maybe that would be a good translation. And what was important for us when launching the project was, on the one hand, sustainability of our work as well. So we also have a range of documentation of videos, of podcasts, of images, of many different things from our past events, where knowledge is always generated, new knowledge is generated, old knowledge is exchanged and we put into dialogue. And so this, on the one hand, the Living Archives is a space where we can actually bundle this and make it accessible in one place. Another important aspect for us in making the Living Archives was strategically going about making knowledge and content accessible. I'll say a little more about that later on. And we wanted to build a project that not only collects, but also generates his stories, narratives, and in general, the realities of our communities, and recenters this knowledge. Another thing that was important was reaching people within our communities beyond the boundaries of physical spaces and also beyond the boundaries of Berlin and maybe even Germany. And we wanted to store and preserve content so that we can learn and unlearn and share experiences online and not only on site, which especially now during Corona has become even more important. So the Living Archives, the name is similar to what Sadia says, that we see archives as something living, as something dynamic, and not really, it's less going out there and collecting knowledge, but more like the knowledge comes to us through our communities and is generated within our communities, with us, within our work. So yeah, I could resonate a lot with what Sadia said about archives being something living. In Germany, there are already a number of alternative archives, especially in Berlin. There's IOTO I20tron, which is a Black archive. There's Romani Pen, which is a feminist archive by Roman Sinti, by and for Roman Sinti. But there are also, like, internationally, the archives that are represented here at this webinar, but also, for example, the Trans and Queer, Black, Indigenous, and People of Color Archives Collective in Toronto. So yeah, it's not like we're, I just find it important to also reference what is already being done and what is already there. So we also understand the Living Archives in this tradition of resistant knowledge projects, to quote Patricia Hill Collins. And we see archiving, as I said, as something dynamic that is strongly connected to our communities. And we also see knowledge production in this context as a collaborative process, which next year we will be focusing on more. The website was just launched 2 weeks ago, so it's in the very first phase now, and we still have a lot of work in front of us. And this will be one of the things where we'll see, okay, what kind of methods can we use to collaboratively build this page? And in summary, we see archive and documentation of knowledge and the transfer of knowledge in this context as a decolonial radical act. And we see concepts and practices of archiving that in the end do have traditional practices and concepts of archiving that have a colonial, racist, and heteronormative context, and try and redefine this and use archiving as a medium of counter-narration. What we also dealt with a lot during the conception of the page, and that will also be following us during the next year, is the concept of unarchiving. So also the question of how we can, so to say, excavate or even imagine certain things and certain knowledges that have been erased or taken from us, or that have been silenced. So yes, at the moment, the main content on our on the website, The Living Archives, is work that has been, is content that was created in the framework of our work at Salzgitter. But we also have some texts and images that we gave, that were commissioned just for this page, just to kind of get it started. And we see the website as something that's going to be a constant work in progress. So there won't be that eventual time when the page is finished, because it will be constantly, we'll be constantly rethinking it, and yeah, it will be a constant work in progress. So maybe just a few things concretely to the page. There are two main areas of the page. We have the Living Archive on the one hand, which consists of the documentations of our events and the texts, and where we also use many different formats, images, podcasts, texts, videos, etc. In this space, the Living Archive, there's also a reading area where we will constantly, which will also be constantly be getting larger and larger, where we have literature that we found important, or which we find important, but that as well is, we are hoping that there as well we can kind of build that this collection of literature on a collaborative, with collaborative methods more and more during the next few years. And then there's also a search function where you can browse the site, but this is also still in at a very we're at a very early stage, because something that we also dealt with a lot and are still dealing with is questions of categorization, and how do we actually categorize, and who actually defines how and what is, and in what way things are categorized. And for this, we are also planning a workshop next year to kind of find out, okay, what methods can we use, and what do our communities want, and so on and so forth. So at the moment, that search function is not really working that well, because it's there's no, yeah, as I said, we're still kind of seeing how we can develop that more.
Yeah.
And then there's the second main part of the page, which is the Learning Diaspora space, which is the more kind of interactive part of the website, and the goal is the promotion of active exchange and knowledge transfer through online workshops or live broadcasts of events, etc. The events and the topics mentioned in the Learning Diaspora space are reflected again in the archive, and both of the areas are strongly connected and stand, so to say, in dialogue with each other. And yeah, the learning space is more about sharing common experiences, realities, and, as I said, learning and unlearning together.
That's brilliant. And I think you've answered, because something that somebody in the chat was asking is about whether this is a physical space, but I think you're talking about co-located physical spaces, aren't you? That are almost, yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that introduction, Iris. I'm going to move on now, and we've got plenty of time for questions as well. I'm going to move on now to Jennifer. Jennifer, you'd like to take a few minutes to introduce yourself and your projects?
Yes. Hi. Hello. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for the other speakers' contributions. I've been really fascinated to hear about what's going on kind of around the UK and beyond. It's quite interesting to see the parallels. I work for an organisation called the Ahmed Iqbal Ullah Education Trust, and we're a sister organisation to the Ahmed Iqbal Ullah Race Centre. So I'll start by telling you about the Race Centre. It was founded in 2001 by Professor Lou Kushnick, who is a sociology professor at the University of Manchester. And he founded the organisation because he observed that there were no Black people on campus at the University of Manchester at the time. This would be the late 1990s. and he wanted to try and do something to address that issue. So he set up an open access library, and he hoped that this library would kind of be a bridge between the university campus and people living in the city of Manchester from diverse backgrounds, and to encourage a kind of change not only in the studentship but in kind of learning that's facilitated between academic people at the university and kind of community researchers out beyond the campus. And so he used the collection of books that he'd amassed. He was editor of a journal called Sage Race Relations, and had spent a long time kind of working on that, and had amassed a lot of books on race relations that he used to form this open access library. The organisation I work for, the Education Trust, was founded a little bit late. So the Race Centre was founded in '99, and then the Education Trust was founded in 2001, and it was basically to do more work out in the community. It was quickly realised that these academic books didn't quite sort of gel with the more dynamic sort of relationships that he wanted to develop. So he appointed Jackie Old, who later became our director. She's a former ESOL teacher and Black Achievement teacher, and she did a lot of work in schools originally to try and develop content that engaged young people, but also formed kind of archives that would be held in the library. So she started by doing kind of project work in schools, quickly realised that although that was an interesting process, it wasn't leading to quality kind of outcomes, because young people, I think a lot of the people that were involved in those early interviews were self-censoring because of the audience that they were speaking to, but also the young people were kind of not experienced enough to pick up on verbal clues in the interviews. So she started to develop kind of larger scale projects in partnership with community organisations. And the first one was called Yemeni Roots Salford Lives, which was a project that I was brought in to manage back in 2010. So I already worked a lot in museums and galleries before then, but I was really fascinated by the approach of this new project, which felt really different in outlook. So I was interviewed by community members, and then we formed a steering group for the project, which included kind of staff from our organisation, but mainly community members. And we worked together to figure out the dynamics of the project and who we would interview and how we would represent the content collected through that project work. And after that project, we ran a few more projects along those lines on various different subjects. While that was happening, we got lots of referrals from the Heritage Lottery Fund. We started becoming a sort of centre of knowledge for how to run community projects. And we were doing a lot of work kind of unpaid for the Heritage Lottery, advising groups on their funding applications, helping them writing support letters, running training sessions in oral history, talking to them about how to arrange an archive, how to safeguard people working on the project, how to represent what they collected through exhibitions and displays. We also physically help them with exhibition space because we're based in Central Library in Manchester, so it's a very visible, accessible public space, and one of the few places in the city where communities can access, and it's widely used by the public. And we also shared equipment with them, recording equipment and lots of technical expertise, and then quickly realised that that was unsustainable because we needed resources to do that. So Jackie, who is now our director, applied for funding to run a project called Coming In From the Cold, which I've been managing for the last 3 years. And that was specifically, instead of we moved from generating our own projects to supporting communities to run theirs. And we've, over 3 years we've had contact with about 80 different projects, and we expect to archive over 30 of those projects. So most of those projects, well, all of those projects are self-generated. They're based on ideas that the communities identify as interesting or important to them. And all we do is advise on kind of how to run things practically, or how to we've actually, with coming in from Nicole, we got an archivist for the first time, and so we were able to develop systems to work with communities to describe the archives and make them accessible to the public. So we've kind of been overhauling all of our systems in partnership with the communities that we're working with, and that project's due to finish in March. And we're just assessing kind of what we're going to do moving forward as a result of that learning. But we've also launched in parallel a COVID collecting project, because we were aware that most of the mainstream organisations around us were doing that, and that the voices of the communities we work with were being missed out of that completely. So we've got some emergency funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund and from the Resources for Racial Justice programme to encourage people who are kind of living through the pandemic to document their experiences, and so that can be made public too.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that introduction, Jennifer, and for an overview of the way that that your organisation is working. So I just want to kind of go into questions now, just a few questions that we've got for the panel. Thank you to everyone who's been putting your questions in the chat. Keep them coming, and we'll come back to them in about 20 minutes. So we've got about 20 minutes to discuss these few matters that some of the introductions have raised, because you've raised a number of questions and queries about the nature of the archive that involve some of the key issues that are rooted in inequalities and power, such as representation, participation, struggle, authenticity, narratology, and ownership. But also it's interesting in the ways that this is so related to knowledge production, intersectionality, and those bigger socio-political dynamics such as capitalism, racism, and colonialism, and that these can't be removed from the Black minoritized archiving process. So if the panel can just all come in and give me 2 minutes around what you think are some of the challenges and issues that you've experienced in doing Black and minoritized community and cultural archival work. And if we could go to just back in the order that we were before, if we can go to Sadia, that'd be great, thanks.
I was going to think of like trying to break it down into just like 1 or 2 things, but there's so many. I think for us, because we're working with such a diverse community, and especially a community that's not reflected in the archives, it's very difficult to explain the importance of the work that we're doing, because there's not many examples to show them. So they don't see themselves as part of British history. They don't see themselves reflected in museums or archive spaces, so or in history books. So they'll never, you know, we weren't brought up with anything to do with our heritage in any history lessons, and the only other racial person that we were ever taught about was Mary Seacole, and that's literally about the other, you know, the only coloured Black representative of sort of British history. So for us, the challenge is educating without being, you know, disparaging to the communities, to educate them in the importance of what archives mean, and how that then in turn affects our own sense of belonging. It also affects how history is made, how history is portrayed in the classroom, and how we can make that more reflective of who we are, give our version, well, not our version of events, but give our bit. That's kind of the missing link in some of the stories. So I think as a starting point, that's probably been the most difficult thing, is getting the community involved, and making sure that they understand why. So it's not just collecting, but having that understanding and being able to portray that to them, so that it's not just, you know, we've got somebody's story and that's it, and it's going to be put in in a museum, because that's probably the easiest way for them to explain, to understand what it means. So, you know, engaging with the community and getting that message across, the importance of the archive.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Sadia. I'd like to open that up to Rhoda now.
Gosh, where to start? Maybe I'll start with talking about money. Seems always a good thing to think about. But yeah, in terms of just like organizational resilience, you know, like securing consistent funding for the work that we do, and also funding for the parts of the work that aren't maybe as attractive to some funding bodies. So thinking about more like internal and infrastructural work, like I think it's been mentioned before, you know, thinking about like cataloguing systems and how we're classifying material and how we're not reproducing power dynamics in the sense of how we're actually, you know, like preserving these materials. These are things that actually do take a lot of time and energy and money to think about and make change for, but because they're maybe not as, the outputs of that work aren't as easily presented or perhaps like co-opted, it's kind of hard to secure and sustain funding for that. I'm also thinking about BCA is like just a team of people, and the fact that we are an incredibly lean team. We have 4 full-time staff, which I know for some organisations that's loads of people, but for the kind of remit of what we're trying to do in terms of being national, that's tiny. So trying to think about the sustainability of the people who are doing this work, and then also I think it kind of backs onto that, but something I've been thinking about recently in terms of BCA's kind of mission to be a national organisation, and kind of squaring that with where BCA started, which is, you know, like a group of educators and parents in Brixton in the late 70s, and whether this is like a tricky thing to get into, but whether like a national organisation is preferred in some ways, and in terms of like trying to be honest about what we can do and trying to make the case for people doing this work across the UK, and making the case for instance, you know, if material is really like localised to Devon, then, you know, maybe it should stay in Devon. So trying to support other archives and other initiatives to do this work whilst also being sustainable as an organisation are some of the things like, yeah, on the top of my mind right now.
Brilliant, Rhoda. Thank you so much for that. Iris, would you like to come in? I think it's a good point for you to come in now.
Okay, now. So I can only agree with what Rhoda and Sadia said. And on the top of my list would also be resources, not only funding, but mainly funding and consistent funding. I think this is a problem that many community projects just do have, at least in Germany. That is a problem, that if we do manage to get funding, then, which is not very often, then it often is only for a year or 2 years. And then, you know, the question is, okay, will this funding be further, will we get it further or not, and so on and so forth. But I think in the context of our work, just being heard is also a problem, and also in this whole context of knowledge validation, of whether our knowledge is important or not, and whether it's important that this knowledge is out there, which is then connected with this whole funding issue. So kind of arguing this fact that it is important can be very difficult. And in our case, I just know that that it's just due to like having a big network and knowing the right people and doing enough lobby work that actually helped us to get the funding, not only for Gesetzesblätter, but also for the Living Archives, which also is mainly due to one Black person who works and is part of the community, who works in this Civic Centre for Education, who supported us, which I think is also very important to say. So yeah, then we have this whole question, which is something that always is in our mind when we talk about decolonial theory and praxis, post-colonial theory, who actually defines what is valid knowledge, what isn't, who is an expert and who isn't an expert, and who gets to do the work then in the end and gets the money for that. And what is acknowledged and what is not. And then what Rhoda was saying, this internal work, which is also extremely important, but that doesn't necessarily produce something visible that can, be published or put on their website or whatever, but which is also extremely important. That is also it's very difficult to get funding for that as well. So this work is often done just, on a voluntary basis or pro bono, without really being able to pay the people for that work. I guess that's just a few more things in addition to what Sadia and Rhoda said.
Great, and I love the way that this is progressing very nicely along the way, and everybody's adding something else to a list of I think kind of reparation demands it should be really. But moving on to Jennifer, do you want to add anything to that, to what's been said, Jennifer?
Yeah, I agree with what everybody's said. We're all struggling with exactly the same issues. I think on the sustainability issue, I think that project-led funding doesn't help because it's really hard to think long-term, and quite often you're trying to work towards quite big kind of shifts in thinking, around like power and about systematic change, and that's really hard to do project by project. Just thinking more about power, I would say that it's a massive issue in our organisation because the Centre is part of the University of Manchester Special Collections. It has only recently become that. We were previously just a sort of autonomous thing that floated around the university. And it depended which academic took pity on us as to which department we ended up in. So we've been in social responsibility, we've been part of humanities, and now we're part of the library. That comes with lots of caveats because we have to fit in with wider mainstream line of library systems and things. The Education Trust is autonomous, it's an independent charity, but then it lurches from funding pot to funding pot, and most of the staff employed through the Education Trust are temporary. So it is really, really difficult. And a part of coming in from the cold was project was about addressing lack of diversity in the archive sector. I think that was mentioned previously. Partly we'd done a lot of work to try and explain what an archive is, because most of the communities that we were working with on heritage projects were doing it for engagement purposes, and so we were trying to explain to them the long-term value of documenting and collecting that process. And we had to go right back to the beginning and say, this is what an archive looks like, this is why it's here, this is who uses it, this is how it's looked after, this is how much it might take you as part of your project on top of what you wanted to do. So we've had to do a lot of that explaining work. But also then we didn't want to take things off communities and give them to academics at the university. So we've tried to do a lot of work around getting academics and communities to work together, or getting academics to buy in community knowledge and expertise so that they paid for things that they bring to academic projects, and just to kind of share. I think it's always a challenge. We've not nailed it, but just being aware of power and where it lies, and what you need to do all the time to address that power. And obviously, as a white person working in the sector, I'm totally aware of the power that I have and the difference of experience that it is for me to some of the colleagues that I work with. So, and the trainees that we work with, we started off quite naively by trying to recruit sort of school leaver people and train them, give them some work experience, but that has proved a kind of dead end really, because you need qualifications to become an archivist. So we've kept people for longer and put them through professional qualifications, so they are actually going to go into the sector and be able to work beyond the life of the project, hopefully, and start to that hopefully will have an influence.
Yeah. Thank you a lot, Jennifer. And that lack of investment in Black minoritized communities in terms of access to education, not only resources, is a really, really important one. So we've got about 5 minutes left before we go into open questions. So keep your questions coming in the chat. Thank you to everybody who's been contributing to that. And thank you so much for raising some really key issues as we go into the second question that I want to bring in around issues to do with sustainability. And actually, you've all kind of mentioned many things that are very appropriate in relation to this subject area. You've talked about how hard it is to sustain organisations, that we need to have that investment in Black minoritized infrastructure that isn't always attached to just project after project. There was a question around whose history it is and who the expert is. So having a think about problems of sustainability within your organisations and within the work that you're doing. I wonder if you could if any of you want to come forward in the last 5 minutes of this section, just to focus on how your organisation is dealing with the issue and problem of sustainability. Now, many of you have talked about resources in relation to funding, but I'm also interested in the idea about the vision. You know, how do you sustain that grassroots ownership in terms of the vision of the organisation and what you're doing? And feel free to talk about the resourcing of it as well. And would anyone like to come in there? Just open it up because we've got about 5 minutes now. Does anybody want to talk about how they're sustaining the vision of their organisation alongside the resources and the funding? Okay, I think Rhoda's coming in here. Thanks, Rhoda.
Yeah, I'm coming in, not sure. But I just wanted to make a brief point that I think in terms of what the vision for sustainability is, the only way it works is if we see it as not just our own organisation, but trying to partner and work as much as possible with other Black archives, other people who are doing this work, other archivists trained or otherwise, memory keepers, like whoever it may be. Recently I got a really interesting email from someone, I'm not going to hot them up, who had received an email asking to partner on a project, their organisation, and they just had some thoughts about it. They said there's something weird, like what does BCA think? Like, what should we do? And it was really interesting because by the end it meant that we could speak on behalf of like both of our organisations rather than one, and kind of, yeah, just advocate for ourselves a little bit easier and in a way that felt a bit more impactful. So yeah, I mean, I don't have a very clear answer, but I just know that it relies on us not seeing ourselves as individual organisations, for sure.
I completely agree with Rhoda, because that's the only way, and that's the basis that we actually started on, was collaboration and getting people on board that can help us, because we don't have all the expertise and the professional stability that our organization needs. So we've always used collaboration as a platform to move forward, and then that's sort of developed further into training and building the partnerships with universities and places where people then can get that training, so they can sort of, you know, so to move it on as a legacy, so it's not just us who's doing the work, so when we're gone, that the work's being continued. So, and that's, you know, if you don't mention funding, which is like the foundation of all of our issues. So yeah, collaboration is definitely the key for sustainability for us.
Great, thank you. Iris?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I see now that because we started very, very small, and we're still quite small, but we do have a few more projects and a bit more money and a few more people working here. And I think the challenges that we often face is this navigating between being institutionalized more and more, and the restraints that come with that, and not losing touch, you know, with the communities. And I think that's always something that you have to be very mindful of. And I also agree that collaboration and keeping in touch and these dialogues and conversations are very, very important, which is why as well we we work a lot in cooperation, or we do a lot of networking, and we also have, for example, internal focus groups that just, you know, to see, okay, what do you think? What are your issues? What are you, you know, what are your worries? And just to kind of try to keep in touch with the communities and see, because we see ourselves as kind of, you know, it's not just Salzgitter. We're doing the, you know, we're kind of just a voice for the different communities that we are part of, and to keep reminding ourselves of that. I think that's very important.
Thanks so much, Iris. So I think, Jennifer, is there anything you want to add that before we move on?
Again, people have said the important things really about just maintaining relationships. I think we get approached a lot by mainstream organisations who want a quick fix. You know, can you put us in touch with these people? We need this thing now. And it's like, no, we need you to do that work yourself. And we're not kind of here just to find you X, Y, and Z person because it's convenient to do so in this small window. You need to invest in building relationships and do it yourself, really. And we get approached by organisations, cultural organisations that want to offload things on us as well, quite a lot. So pieces of work that haven't been accessioned into their collection that were developed with community groups. And we're trying to advocate for a more knowledgeable approach to this kind of work in our sector. So we want people to value the time that communities give, and to then take the things that are produced as a result of that as seriously as any other objects within the collections. So that they're kind of things that we're trying to champion. We work a lot with other partners in Greater Manchester. So there's something called the Greater Manchester Museums and Archives Libraries, no, it's Archives Local and Local Studies Partnership. And we've tried all different ways of working with them to encourage them to do their own work. And I think I think it was Rhoda mentioned about whether collections come to you or go to places where they were generated. And I find that really interesting, because we've worked with one borough which had it was completely inactive and had never done a kind of BAME heritage project before. And a group approached us in that borough and we were really excited and we've supported them, but they want to archive in that borough. So we're, instead of saying, no, if you work with us, you have to give us your stuff, we've worked with them, and then we're going to work with the archivists in that borough to make sure it's visible and accessible within the locality where it happened. So we don't really care where the stuff ends up, so long as it ends up somewhere and is taken seriously and then made accessible to the public.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that, Jennifer. We've got a number of questions that I've just been kind of grouping together that have come through the chat. So thanks for the questions. Keep them coming. So there's a few questions that have come specifically for some of you, but they're in three broad areas at the minute. There's a specific one for Rhoda that's to do with the Black Cultural Archives, which I come on to. There's been several questions that have come through that are around language and terms. And it's quite interesting because when there's the use of the word BAME, it's usually people talking about people of colour. It's not coming from communities. And but there's also this idea about different terms that are used, you know, within the heritage industry sector, so to speak. So we've talked about ephemera, the living archive. Actually, what do these mean? And are these terms negotiated differently in terms of the different communities that we're working with? And then finally, there's been some questions that have been more specifically about looking at kind of the future of Black cultural projects, but also issues around education programs, and also the further representation of marginalized communities, bringing in that idea around intersectionality in terms of thinking about, say, for example, Black minoritized LGBTQIAA+ history. Yeah, so I just wondered if we could maybe start with Rhoda with some of the specific questions around the Black Cultural Archives. I think it was Vamos who asked, has the Black Cultural Archive been viewed differently now that there's a permanent site? And there's also a second question about your partnership with the V&A Museum as well.
Okay, cool, thank you. So has BCA been viewed differently now it's got a permanent site? I would say BCA, I mean, the short answer is yes, but I guess BCA also views itself differently, in the sense of having a permanent site means having a permanent home for the collections, and it also means having like a permanent social space. So BCA as a place where archives are stored, and BCA is a place where people exchange and just live is really important, I think, to BCA's mission. I think BCA having a permanent site there are so many different things within that, because of course having a permanent site is a real achievement and something that comes after decades of work. Having a permanent site doesn't mean that your organisation is not precarious anymore, and I think maybe that's something that BCA has struggled with. Like, for instance, in 2018 there was a real like low moment for BCA in terms of finances, and I think it took a while for people to understand that BCA wasn't like serious threat of closure, because there's this big shiny Georgian building, so it looks like things are kind of going well. So I think there are many different issues like tied up in having a permanent site, but ultimately I think it's just really important that there is this like physical monument to Black history, and that there is somewhere that people can always return to. In terms of the partnership with V&A, that was slightly before my time, but it's interesting to talk about. So it was a partnership with V&A. They were doing an exhibition called Staying Power, which was a photography exhibition kind of highlighting Black photographers in the UK. So as part of that partnership, BCA's role was to collect histories from those photographers and also subjects in those photographs. So I think that's quite like an interesting, in terms of thinking about what BCA's role is in a kind of like wider arts and heritage sector. I guess that was seen as like slightly work that would be like reparative in the sense of not only showing those photographs, but also like collecting the actual histories of those photographers and those subjects. Again, I think there are questions around that in terms of like what a Black archive's responsibility is to like other national organisations, whether BCA and other organisations should be trying to in some way help other organisations have like a wider or more pluralistic view. Those are interesting questions that I'm thinking about, but I hope that answers.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Rhoda. Iris, I'd like to bring you in around this question around language and terms. So please, other panelists, feel free to come in, but I think particularly in relation to some of the things that you've discussed, Iris. So discussing this use of the word BAME and its relevancy, and how that language and those terms for minoritized and marginalized communities are, how do we cross that line between what is weaponized against us, but actually how we take ownership of such terms as well, and how we want to define ourselves. Carol Boyce Davies in Migration, the Subject, has talked a lot about this, about how language is something to be owned by whoever, and it's a flexible, breathing thing, you know, in terms of definition. And also there was a question in relation to that, not just about BAME, but also about the use of some certain terms, such as ephemera, living archive, which are a couple of terms which you've raised. So I just wondered if you could respond to that, Iris.
So what exactly is the question surrounding BAME? Because the thing is that in Germany, we don't use BAME, so
yeah,
I think
a lot of Black minoritized communities don't want to use BAME, but what's happened, I think, in a context, probably a very Eurocentric context, but particularly in the UK, is there's become this amalgamized way of referring to marginalized minoritized communities under this term BAME. So there's this constant issue and tension within the use of language and who uses language, because actually for community of colours to define themselves in the way they choose to define themselves as something, but for people outside of those communities to use certain definitions there can be a lot of tension arising. So somebody had asked in the chat about that tension around the use of the word BAME. Maybe somebody else can come in around that, but I just wondered if you wanted to speak a bit more about language and terms and how you overcome that, and thinking about how defining they can be, but also how different they are to different people.
I guess in Germany, it's a very specific situation, because Germany is lagging very far behind when it comes to dealing with racism, when it comes to dealing with its colonial past and things like that. So when it comes to definitions, it's only been recently actually that also in mainstream media, for example, the terms even Black and POC have been started to be used. And before that, it was mainly either, it was really foreigners or this weird term with migration background, which was often used in, which is often used in Germany, which is just wrong, because on the one hand, this could be anyone from Sweden to, I don't know, France, and Black people and people of color in Germany don't necessarily have to have a migration background. So this is only something that has developed in the last 2 years, and now even more due to the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that, the visibility of the Black Lives Matter movement. So, and when it comes to terms, I guess, especially when it comes to funding, we also realize that we use terms strategically. And, you know, there are buzzwords like decoloniality and intersectionality and et cetera, and so it's always this dilemma of how are these terms and everything that surrounds them co-opted and misused, and also how is the history of these concepts just kind of negated, and at the same time, how do we need to use them to actually be heard and to get the funding? So that is actually a kind of difficulty. And I realize that on the one hand, I say, you know, we work on decolonial theory and praxis, and we see it as a decolonial act. And at the same time, I feel this kind of, I feel a bit strange using it, because I know that in the last 2-3 years, it's become a buzzword in academia, in mainstream media, in lots of things, and is kind of but distant from where it actually comes from. So yeah, maybe I hope that.
Yeah, thanks, Iris. Does anybody else want to come in? Because actually in the chat, there is a lot of discussion about BAME. We've got Beverly Previtt-Goldstein, who is, you know, a well-known kind of academic and heritage activist in the region, who's talked about the rejection of the use of BAME. And a lot of, I mean, you know, Black minoritized communities generally are rejecting pejoratized acronyms, because of the diversity within communities, etc. But also Eve's brought in the use of the way that BAME is being very much linked to COVID and the things that have happened recently. Obviously, because of Black Lives Matter, that's really brought around a lot of consideration about the ways that language and terms are being used. Again, as I mentioned before, are they being used as a punitive way as a weapon against communities, or are they being used to define communities? And sometimes there's a fine line between both of them. So does anybody else want to bring in anything around the use of the term BAME, or even some of the use of these terminologies, such as ephemera, such as living archive?
Can I just pitch in, because we did discuss this in a team meeting a few weeks ago. The BAME overstatement is really brilliant and worth a read. I have to say that most of the colleagues I work with are from ethnic minority backgrounds, and all kind of wanted to be given the opportunity to self-identify about how they were described. But then we discussed collective terms and how to refer to the work that we do collectively, and how to describe that on an application form, where you're quite often given a very limited word count. And also to describe the work of our organisation, which is pan-community and crosses lots of different cultural boundaries. So it's a really complex issue that we didn't really resolve. We're keenly aware of the importance of encouraging people to self-define, and that's why we're developing archiving systems where people describe the material that they've collected and the keywords and how the collections are arranged for themselves. But we couldn't we couldn't agree on how to describe our organisation's work collectively, so we're still having that conversation.
Does anybody else want to come in on that before we move on to the next question? Chantal has put very interesting about how there's a BAME over hashtag, but also just a reminder, we are the global majority. So, you know, often we use the word minoritized to really represent the systemic and institutional discrimination and minoritization that actively goes on, particularly within a Eurocentric context. So does anybody want to come in on that anymore, or should we move on to some of the next questions that have come up?
I just wanted to say one thing. I mean, I guess one of the issues with BAME or certain like acronyms is the sense of shifting goalposts and people being lost in those terms, and the sense that they can cover so many different types of people that you can hide quite well under those terms, and I think this is something that happens. And I think difference is still the thing that we should be celebrating and making central. And even it's interesting thinking about things like funding applications, which won't give you the space to accurately define what it is that you're doing and the complexity around that. And I think it's worth fighting against that. You know, even thinking about Black archives as a sector and what we're all doing here, in a sense, you know, that there are things that need to be unpacked about who we're talking about and what we mean. I mean, I think BCA has been quite clear about being, you know, buying for people of African and Caribbean descent in the UK, but and that's a choice to state that as clearly as possible so things don't get obscured, I think.
See. Thank you so much. I think that's a really, really integral discussion. So thank you for taking the time to bring up all of those brilliant points. I just want to move on now to some of the other questions that have come in that have been around education and representation. So this idea about in terms of what educative materials are available, you know, they're not available in a mainstream curricular context. Generally, yep. So in the archives, and Sadia, I'm going to come to you because I know you do a lot around education and looking at education within the work that you do, and I just wondered what you felt about the way that the role of education within the archival work, and also how you think we can start to progress this within our mainstream narratives and historical points of view.
I think the burden of that has fallen on us to generate that material, to show what it should look like, because any attempts outside of the community fall short of that. So we've taken it upon ourselves to create educational material that's curriculum related, but it's also something that can be used outside of the, you know, mainstream school classroom. So they're also used within madrasa classrooms and other community classrooms, just so those children and sometimes even adults have a connection, have a point of contact to what an archive is, and what kind of stories and narratives can build from that, because we don't see ourselves reflected in mainstream education. It's got to be something that we have to sort of work backwards. So we kind of have the responsibility of teaching, like Jennifer was saying, teaching the community about what an archive is, for you know, as a starting point, and then talking about what that looks like, and then being able to incorporate that into sort of everyday life and how, you know, archives are a part of our lives. So look at it from a family archive point of view and an organizational point of view, and then develop resources around those things. So, and then package them in a way that you would as a classroom lesson. So teachers have lesson plans and schemes of work that they can see, oh, okay, well, you know, that history, the minority history, is actually not a separate history, but we've also tried to package it in a way, or place it, rather than package it, but place it in a way where it's part of British history and part of British society. So it's not a separate thing. Oh, this is what the Muslims do, or this is what the Black African Caribbean community did. It's part of, this is what happening was at the time, and this is how the community were part of that. So, and the way we actually position our archives as well, we do them very localized. So everything that's done within a particular community is archived within a local archive. So it's more accessible, it's more widely accessible, and then the collections are linked. So we know that if there's something about a particular community in one collection, actually there's something that's related in a different collection in a different area. So it becomes a more homogenized story rather than a minoritized story. So that's how we approach it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sadia. Thank you for that. This kind of leads on to thinking about representation, but also how we can encourage younger generations to engage with projects and archives, and which obviously contributes to sustainability, but also is a shifting narrative, isn't it, around the many kind of histories around our communities. So I just wondered if anybody wanted to come in to talk about how we can encourage, and this was a question from Azin, how we encourage younger generations to engage with our archival projects, and how that could contribute to its sustainability. Jennifer, would you like to come in, or would anybody else like to come in there?
So I mentioned that we do a lot of work in schools. That sometimes is like around informing young people of archives, you know, around kind of primary and secondary sources and how can use those within the teaching the curriculum. I've worked with the Runnymede Trust on a project to try and get young people to interview elders and then to analyse that material and think about it in relation to their kind of wider studies. And they also did sort of creative interpretations with the Royal Northern College of Music, where they turned it into a performance. So we do a lot of that sort of creative work with young people and looking at how to use collections to generate interest. But I mentioned that I worked on the Emily Root Salford Lives project, and we realised that when we do oral history work in communities, we quite often just look at older people, but it is quite interesting to include young voices as well. So we ended up interviewing 3 generations within that community to look at the difference of experience between generations and the different kind of attitudes within that community, that to show the diversity really, and that it's not a homogenous group of people. And the young people went on to produce they did a mapping exercise. So we produced a big map. We plotted onto that map sites of interest and memories from the oral histories of older people, and then overlaid that with their experiences of living there today. So it became a sort of an examination of the geography of the area, but then kind of interspersed with memory as well. So we do a lot of things to try and get young people engaged and to generate material for the archive too.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thanks. Okay, so sorry, Iris, would you like to come in there?
Yeah, I would like to come in there because I mean, this is a question that has been posed to Salzburger a few times, where we have a lot of respect of, because we don't generally work with children, but also because we realize that it's very different. Working with children is very different from working with young adults or adults, and that we don't feel competent on that area yet, and we're still quite a young organization. But what Jennifer was saying about the different generations, what we do try and do a lot, and what was the focus of our project last year, Passing It On, was these intergenerational conversations, where on the one hand we had reading groups where we looked at texts from the 80s and the 70s in the German context, and then we had 3 different talks which we called contemporary witness talks, where we had 3 people each from a different generation, starting in the 80s till today. And then we had a winter school where we kind of had this intergenerational discussion on different topics. So I guess these intergenerational conversations are very important. And on the one hand to see, okay, what can we learn from what has been done? And on the other hand, you know, how can we, how can we kind of get into dialogue and create something new from that? Yeah.
Great, thanks so much for that. And I think talking about that idea about intergenerationality, it really crosses over with our considerations around intersectionality as well. So we've got a couple of questions before we finish off. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I hope we can pack it in. So the second last question I want to ask, which Kath has raised, but a few other people have alluded to as well, is what do you think has been the impact of the pandemic and the significant events regarding obviously the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement within whatever context that you're working? And what's been that impact on your organisations? What's shifted? What has changed? And feel free to come in if anybody would like to come in. Rhoda, would you like to make a start?
Yes, I can try. COVID and yeah, I mean, it's been such a long year, and I think, yeah, I mean, so I think I'll touch upon a few points. COVID and its effect on Black people in the UK has meant that as an organisation we've been kind of thinking and struggling on different levels, both kind of like personally and organisationally, and in thinking about how we also potentially collect around that experience. That was something that was kind of coming up at the start of the year, and we kind of realised that we weren't in a position to do it because there are so many things to think about when collecting stories around health. And in ensuring like the safety of the people that you're collecting, so we couldn't quite do it. But it did kind of shift our attention onto how we provide our collections, how we provide the experience of our collections to people remotely. I think digital working is something that's probably come up for a lot of people, and it definitely came up for us. In terms of like accessibility to the collections, these are things that we're going to keep thinking about, but there's also this balance between digitizing collections and also providing like a physical space and a physical home for people and collections, and trying to find a balance between the two things. In terms of this year's wave of Black Lives Matter protests, they affected us again across many, many levels. I think it's probably good to talk about burnout, which is something that many organisations face, and it's something this year it's been a real struggle to try and meet all these different events as an organisation whilst also being okay. There have been a lot of opportunities that have suddenly made themselves known post-June, post the murdering of George Floyd, and as an organisation, you know, concerned with our resilience, we're trying to take opportunities as they come, but also not fall into other people's time cycles, and to do kind of what's best for us in a long-term game, not just thinking about 2020, but, you know, thinking about decades and centuries. So yeah, a lot of things have come up.
Thank you so much for that. Does anybody else want to come in about that? And hopefully we can get some reflections and comments from the audience as well in relation to this and the rest of the discussion, which would be absolutely great. Is there anybody that would like to add to that around how the pandemic and Black Lives Matter has specifically affected your organisation or shifted the way that you work?
Could I say something?
Yeah, please come in. So this
Sorry,
is.
I'm a member of. I've been a member of an organisation since 1997 in Newcastle here called it's Newcastle North East of England African Community Association, and we've done a lot of events over the years, and I know obviously with the pandemic there has been effects in terms of I've sort of stepped down from the executive, but I'm still a member. But sort of I think the context of this meeting I think has been about archiving, and I think that's critically important. I'm a member of a Methodist church, and the church itself feels that I'm a member of. It's got quite a diverse congregation, that since the George Floyd, you know, there's quite a lot of things involved really, from the COVID to George Floyd incidents, Black Lives Matter. The church felt that you know, supporting the Black Lives Matter, they have a regular every month a meeting, anti-racism reading group. But it's about, the church said it's about not only educating themselves about Black experiences, it's about taking action, some form of action. So, but in a, sort of in a nutshell, I think education is critically important. Me as a Black male, I come from Oxford originally. I've been in the Northeast a long time. And I just see that there hasn't been much changes, especially for Black people. Apart from not only the legacy that's still affecting us now, in terms of building the wealth of this country and getting nothing out of it. I've seen in education, I'm now a teacher. I used to be an engineer in industry. I left that 2000. I'm a teacher. I've seen things in education when in early days of even schools, I'm monitoring sessions and seeing things subtly negative actually towards the people of ethnic. I have experienced that, not broadly, but from where I came from, Oxford, what happened regularly was regular Saturday schools. I don't know how often they're still happening, but I do know it's happening. Where what I'm talking about is statistics that seem to have not changed, especially for Black kids. Black kids appearing to perform pretty well in primary, and especially Black boys. And once they go into secondary, when they leave secondary, which is critical for their career launch, something drastically happens. It was almost like constant failures. The situation is so complex, but this is a bad trend. I as a teacher, I teach now maths and other things I've taught in the past. I've been doing a lot of you know, tuitions in the homes. I've had a lot of Black kids. I've had reports from families saying my child they've been saying that my child has maybe got some learning difficulties or is not performing well. And then when I've got involved with the child, and this is not boasting, on a number of occasions, the child is suddenly doing fantastically well in their maths. And you think, here's a pattern going on. There's something seriously going wrong in our educational system. Something seriously going on in our education system, especially in secondary, that's failing some of our children. Yes. Apart from the families who can afford it. But the other day, anyway, I did a presentation because the church wanted it as part of Black History Month. They said, could you choose a theme, Spencer? You know, we've heard a lot of things from you generally, and deliver it. And I did. I delivered it, just an aspect of education that is omitted in our education. And I know a lot of you are doing fantastic work. And I did a delivery of a session of Blacks in Science, Technology. I think the congregation was quite shocked and wondering why is none of this in our history of Black people's contributions in science. A lot of things people take for granted that affects their life today, and they were invented from the 1800s and whatever time by Black people, significant things that affect our lives today. And as a Black child, I never saw any of this in history, in my, only the negative themes of you know, enslavement of Black people, you know, us in change, as if we just landed on the planet in change. And we did have an empire, ancient Egypt before that, Kemet, then Egypt. There's so much stuff that's been like, it disappears, kept under the carpet, under the carpet. And I think, you know, the archiving stuff that's going on now is very important for education. And we need to look at the themes. Unfortunately, policymakers are going to be potentially barriers. And any of us that do get in a position of influencing policy, unfortunately, we may still get outvoted because we won't be the mass numbers. So I think there needs to be some I don't know, professional or policy changes at how things are delivered and allowed to be delivered from people from so-called ethnic group, because that's my worry about policy, the policy makers, not being really being in that position. So
Yeah.
I've done quite a lot. So there is a lot.
No, that's excellent.
There's a lot.
Thank you. I think you've raised some really crucial points there, especially in relation to our region and that lack of engagement with the region's kind of Black minoritized communities history at a basic level. Thank you so much for that, Spencer. I'd like to open this up. Does anybody else want to come in and add to that or comment on that or raise any specific questions? We've had some really interesting questions. Clara has raised an interesting question in the chat, as did Chantal earlier on. Would either of you like to come in, or would like anybody else like to come in?
I do. I
Thanks,
think
Clara.
it's wonderful to listen to all these examples. Amazing amount of work has gone on the cheap. It is very much, you know, satisfying big organizations to tick their boxes. We have funded to let them get on with it. We're not interfering. That's not the point. The point is, what are they going to do about it? From my personal experience and generally looking around, looking at social media, the urgency created by Black Lives Matter has died down. The complacency is setting in, and there is no response coming through. I haven't seen a concrete response to Black Lives Matters, whether from the government or larger agencies. There's a National Archive, there's regional archives. How are they being held accountable? How do we mobilize to make that happen?
Thanks so much for that, Clara. Such an important point, and just history repeating itself, really, isn't it, in relation to some of the big institutions? Absolutely. Yes. Would anyone else like to come in from the floor? Because I think that this conversation is so rich. Is anybody else that'd like to comment about anything we've discussed so far? One of the things that has been raised, which I think is a super important part of this conversation that Chantal raised in the chat and a few other people have alluded to, is what are the future of Black cultural archives and whatever they mean? So would anyone on the floor like to make a comment, or would any of the panelists like to come in and respond to that? Sorry, I'm just trying to toggle and see who I can see, because I'm going to see a few people at once. Because there's some amazing, there's some amazing people who are here in the audience as well, in terms of their wealth of knowledge.
I'd like to go, Rosie, if that's okay. Sorry,
thanks,
tech person. Yeah, so I'm really into like tech and audio production, and I want to know, I'm going to be doing some oral histories for Sangini, for the archives we're doing. How do you see the movement in terms of audio and tech, and bringing it from paperwork and pictures, which are, you know, stored, people maybe not look at them, they're not as accessible to everybody. So in terms of what your organizations are doing and what they plan to do in the future, how are you looking to broaden that in terms of tech and digital?
Brilliant question. If we're moving forward and thinking about the future, would any of the panelists like to come in? Sadia?
Yeah, so all of our archives are digital born. So everything that we do is very sound based, and we use digital formats obviously for all the documents and photographs. What was your specific question in terms of? In terms of
document, in terms of making it accessible, and I don't mean sounds as in, you know, having sound effects or things like that, but how are you going to bring it forward? And I know this is probably a very expensive question, but in the future of tech, where we're becoming such a fast-paced world, where things aren't seen, how are maybe organizations doing it already, but you know, things like oral histories, having a more rich, diverse way of bringing tech into archives, because I believe that that's probably the future that archives are going to need to come up to and step up to, with same as many organizations that aren't even just doing archives.
Oral history interviews that we've done in the past, what we're doing with those, what we've already collected, is we're creating podcasts. So we've got the oral history transcripts, and we've given them to some of our volunteer writers who are sort of extracting stories, either a whole life story or a particular event, and having a series from one person maybe, and they're being scripted and written into kind of radio plays.
Perfect.
So that's one thing we're doing. We also have like clips from our oral histories, either video clips that are available on YouTube. And we've got a platform on SoundCloud as well, which are literally just clips from the oral history. So they're themed. So it might be about migration, it might be about racism.
You're very up in the tech then. I think that's something that maybe a lot of archives would maybe especially learn from and discuss with each other about how others are doing it. So that was more my question in seeing how people do it.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's just really difficult to do because it comes back to funding. It's hugely expensive. A lot of what we've done has been through volunteer work, so that's where it comes down to. It's the money.
Thanks, Leila. So we've got a few minutes left before we sum up what's been an absolutely fantastic event and panel.
Rosie, can I
come in? Sorry.
Yes, sorry, Rosie. I just didn't want to leave this question out because it might be by one of our students.
Yeah.
But it was a follow-up from Clara's comment and statements. Not only, Leila, can I call on you, because you mentioned here in the chat box, not only that, but the situation with National Trust and the Charities Commission is terrifying. I don't know if you wanted to explain that a bit. I didn't want to leave your question out. Thank you.
It was just the situation with the National Trust and the Charities Commission at the moment, because the National Trust had started to highlight some of the links to the dark side of colonial history and talking about the links of some of their properties to the slave trade. And the Charities Commission are saying that they may have to look into the purpose of the National Trust, of its charitable purpose, because they had a few complaints about it from people. So it's just quite terrifying, in amongst everything else, that when an organisation actually starts to try and be maybe a little bit more honest about the history that it's looking after, it then has this comeback on it as an organisation. So yeah, it's just a terrifying thing that's happening.
Thank you for that.
Thanks so much. Would anyone else like to comment? We're just coming up to the end of the panel. I think we're going to get a summary from Susan Ashley and from Kath Badai about the event and some of the issues that have been raised. Is there any final comments from the panel before we go into that?
Sorry, Rosie, I was going to make a comment.
Great, thanks, Padma.
Just quickly, it's been absolutely wonderful, discussion. So I'm really thankful to all the panel members, because what we're doing in the project is also looking at, these are the different strands coming out, as well as being in the present, we're also thinking about the future as to how we're going to take it forward, because there's so much. It's not just limited to the 2 or 3 partners who've been involved. There is so much history out there, living history. So, but having worked in the sector for so many years, and also having worked in the heritage projects, I do feel that the funders also need to look at, how they are also modifying, because everything is so structural. We're talking about communities and what can they do, how can we empower them, but structurally it's built in such a way. I was filling an application for Heritage Lottery Fund, and I felt, unless you're experienced, you can't do it. The language is such, and also where's the match funding coming from? So I feel, and this is where the funders need to work with universities, big institutions, and also work with communities where community groups are equal partners. So they're not volunteers, they're actually getting paid to be at the table. And that's when we could, kind of shift the balance a little bit in terms of equality and equity.
Yeah, equality and equity is such an important part of this. And I think before we move on to Kath and Susan, Iris just quickly wanted to say something before we finish off. Iris, did you want to come in and say something? Yeah, you've gone on mute again, Iris.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say regarding this whole tech issue, I mean, the Living Archives is online archive anyway. So we also have, but there also we try to use different formats, as in also podcasts, and we had scripts of conversations and videos, etc. But on this, relating to COVID, I think despite all of the negative aspects of COVID, what we did realize is the advantages that online formats do have in reducing barriers. Because we realized that taking part in online formats can, for some people, it can be much easier, not only when it comes to like regional, like geographic matters, but also like just in general, it's the barriers of taking part can be much less than actually having to go somewhere. So what Gesangspeter has decided is that even after this whole COVID-19 thing is over, we will continue having online formats in our program because in certain regards, it is actually, it does reduce certain barriers.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Iris. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Susan and Kath, who are going to find a way to summarize this incredible discussion. Thanks, Susan and Kath.
Wow. Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. The input of everybody has been so much appreciated. You realize that we're just starting out here. This is a very new project, and all of the partners that are involved have just begun to think about what is an archive and what is this long history of activism that we've been doing, and how can we save that and mark that and make it useful, in the future. And this is where the archive project came from. It was, I guess it was small in our minds and has turned into something really huge and really quite important. And, I don't really want to speak for everybody. I think that you've all done the speaking yourselves. I mean, a couple of things jump out to me. The whole question around knowledge production, who gets to speak? I think Ira said, who are the experts? Who gets to be the experts? And, changing the workings of power as much as possible. Terminology is part of that. And I noticed that ever since George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, the terminology issue about how to deal with Black, how to deal with BAME keeps coming up all the time. So we need to come up with solutions to that. I'm not sure how we're going to do that. The living archive concept, of course, we're really interested in ground up processes and how we can perpetuate ground up processes, and that being an intergenerational kind of thing, really key. And we were noticing through the summer that there was lots of activities going on that were run by young people. There was Black Lives Matter protests going on by young people who didn't realize that there is a whole history there of activism over the last 20 years, over the last 100 years, I suppose. And that made the archive kind of important too, that there's a history here, there's a heritage here of this kind of work that we need to connect with, The living archives brought up for me the idea of a resource center, and I've really appreciated, just because I'm at the university, speaking what Jennifer was speaking about. And I'm really interested in what can the role of the university be in perpetuating and helping change the way we produce knowledge. I mean, which sounds strange. The university is the capital of authenticated knowledge, but maybe that's what we change first. It's one of those structures that we need to change, and how can we do that? So that's a personal interest of mine. What else came up? Collaboration. Collaboration being key, but let's not make it the kind of collaboration where mainstream institutions come in and just extract knowledge and extract expertise and expect to represent. I mean, no, it can't be like that. How can how can all of you be the drivers of the project, and how do we get, of course, perpetually, how do we get the money to do that? How do we convince the powers that be that we should be doing that? I guess, you know, the potential of tech and digital, it's a mystery to me, but I'm hoping to learn certainly from you, from Iris, from all of you, on how to make sure that whatever we produce with our project, our tiny project, exploits, uses, makes the best of technology and digital processes. Again, it's a way of connecting to young people. But I guess the other thing that's really important to me is how on earth do we move, you know, all of these good works that we're doing, and Clara makes this point, and Rosie always makes this point, how do we move from that to changing structures? I mean, there's institutional processes there that are not good. How do we, is it just about us sitting at the table? I know that Satwinder was talking about that. We have to sit at the table, but I'm not sure. That's a bigger question than us developing a small archive, but I think we always come back to that. How do we affect institutional change in the kinds of things that we're doing? So I don't know, Rosie, Kath, are there other points that you felt you wanted to add? Those are kind of the things that jumped out at me.
Kath, would you like to come in?
Yes, 2 seconds, I'll just get by here. I just want to say thank you first to everyone. But I guess when I was thinking about how to publicize this event, not to exclude any Black feminist theories, of course, Patricia Collins is important. Thank you, Iris, for bringing that perspective in. But I came across this quote by Stuart Hall. You know, he wrote a lot about race representation archives, and it's in the poster. Constituting an archive represents a significant moment on which we need to reflect with care. And I think that this event this afternoon, I hope, gave us that opportunity to reflect with care, to actually have really meaningful debate, even some uncomfortable debates as well, things that bother us warriors, and as Spencer says, you know, it doesn't seem to be going away, it's still there with us. I just wanted to just say that, you know, it's the work of archives, and this work itself, I think it does need care, it does need robustness, it does need challenge. It is precarious, we are living in precarious times. Archives, the issues around it are intricate, of course. The tender moments was on Twitter. I quite like that from the organization, and everyone else as well, from what they said. But what I'd like to end with really is, even with the care, we need action with the care. And I want to just echo Hannah Ishmael quote here on locating an archive, in which she says, this work is about, it's about the present, ongoing and continuing unfinished, open-ended business, I guess. So we must be kind to ourselves. We are all working very hard, but there is a future in which we can change things. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rosie.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Kath. And I think we can end on those words. Absolutely fantastic. And a good way for us to think about things. Sorry, did somebody want to come in there?
It's Susan. I just wanted to add one point. I mean, one of the things I dislike about having these really, really stimulating sessions is we get all excited and we don't have a follow-up. And I'm really feeling always that we need some kind of follow-up. So I would just say, I mean, other than thanking our panelists, I don't know if we did that. Iris, Sadia, Jennifer.
Yeah, I was just going to go and say a big thank you to them all. Yeah.
But I just want to
finish off, and then
I just want to make a suggestion that if anybody, you know, there could be a network of people who are interested in Black cultural archives. If you're interested in establishing something, And I would think the BCA might want to kind of, I don't know, maybe you already have a mechanism. Just drop us an email and perhaps we can set something up. I mean, at the very least, to try and, you know, make this momentum that we've created a bit more effective. Also, just we're putting the video up on the website, and I'll put the website location in the chat. So thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thanks so much, Susan. Thanks, Kat. And a huge thank you to Chantal for all the time. But a huge thank you. Sorry, we've got we've got somebody coming in to say hello. The next generation of archivists, that's who's in the conversation. But I just want to say a really big thank you to all the panelists for your time, for your energy, and for all the work that you do. So thank you so much to Sadia Ahmad, to Rhoda Boateng, to Iris Rajanayagam, to Jennifer Vickers. So thank you. Thanks so much for all of the work that you do. And thank you to everybody who's come along today. So you all take care and keep doing the good work of resistance, Alad. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.